Welcome to the second of the 4 videos in the Rugby Workshop series. This first segment is about the front row and the techniques required to play in the specialised positions of hooker, loose head prop and tight head prop. A full video on the subject called Law 20 Scrummage has been produced by the New Zealand Rugby Referees Association and the New Zealand Rugby Union, principally for referees. But it is equally important that coaches gain a better understanding of the skills and positional responsibilities of their front row players. Here are several segments.
This video has been produced so that referees can gain a better understanding of the various techniques that are used by front row players. It will show different binding grips that are used and variation in body and feet position of the props. The video offers solutions to problems that occur in the front row of scrums, therefore leading to more safer scrummaging in games. The video shows an in-depth look at the contest that occurs between the props at scrum time and what is allowed within the laws of the game. It will demonstrate the correct spines and line techniques that will allow greater safety for players. It is important that all referees have a good practical knowledge of the front row and their requirements for the interest of safety in scrummaging. It is also recommended that this video be viewed several times during the rugby season so that every referee is fully conversant with the different techniques and solutions that are offered and fully understands the workings of the front row in the interests of safety. There is a science in the front row play. I'm not going to go into all of those aspects, but I am going to cover some basic fundamental things with you that I hope will be helpful. First of all, we're going to talk about the loose head, and the loose head prop is probably the most important prop you've got to basically come to terms with, because he's the prop in an unsafe scrum that you can actually use to make the scrum safe. When the muscle group's relaxed, the head and arm move quite freely. Lock the muscle groups of the neck, the shoulder and the arm. They're locked solid. Short back prefers short to medium grip. Right, that's the short grip. From short to medium grip. A longer back prefers a medium to longer grip. The medium grip or forward to the longer grip. Now let us look at the bad feet positioning of props after the hit and the effect it can have on the scrum. With the outside foot forward of the tight head prop, this lock here continues to push onto his prop and the backside tends to drift further outside. The loose head prop continues to push straight through, and if he continues to push straight through, you can see the bad body position can cause the tight head prop to pop. The difficulty now comes for a referee. Somebody's popped. Who gets penalised? The guy whose shoulders are square and he has hit correct position and his whole front row is pushing straight ahead, or the guy who's popped. The backside starts going out particularly, that gives absolute assurance that that team's got a real problem and you've got a judgment problem that you've got to handle and manage. With the 2 feet shoulder width apart on both props and spines in a line, they can push straight through and you don't run the danger of backsides being pushed out by the outside foot being forward. Now in this situation, the loose head prop has got his outside foot forward. If he chooses to use that to his advantage and disappear in towards the opposition hooker, he can then lift the tight head prop out of the scrum. Now let us look at the scrum while it is still in progress and where the ball is still under the feet of the number 8. While the head of the number 8 remains between the hips of the locks and his arms remain properly bound, the scrum is still in progress.
point for the win.
When the head of the number 8 disengages from between the hips of the locks, even though his arms may still be partially bound, the scrum is technically over. In all binding positions of the props, always ensure that the shoulders do not fall below the level of the hips, as is shown in this example. It is important that the referee recognises unsafe binding, particularly in lower grade rugby. If the referee is forced to assist with the binding technique to ensure a safer scrummage, you are more likely to be successful if the loose head prop is given the right of way.
You've just had an insight into the mysteries of the depths of the scrum. If you'd like to learn more, the full front row video is available through the New Zealand Rugby Union. Now we turn to rugby law, the tackled ball law to be precise, one of the most misunderstood and most heavily penalised areas of our game. Riley Bell and international referee Dave Bishop explain the obligations of the tackler, the player tackled and the teammates coming into the play.
Dave, this is one of the important areas of the game that we're going to cover now, and that's the tackle, Law 18. The tackle is the key or the character of rugby. It is the thing that makes rugby what it is, and from that, then the New Zealand game depends on it heavily because that is the beginning of your second and third and fourth phase play. And yet, at the same time though, it still seems to reduce the most penalties in any one match. I believe the figures are up 40–45% or so of penalties are from the tackle.
That's correct.
What are the problems that you're seeing as a referee, and how do you manage the tackle, and what are the things you're looking for in the tackle?
I suppose the important thing in the tackle, of course, is the availability of the ball to be used for subsequential play. And from that point of view, there's certain obligations both on the player who's been tackled and the tackler. So I think if we deal with it in each step, in each sequence, we can have a look at it from a playing and coaching perspective and also from a refereeing perspective. Because if I'm the ball carrier and I'm tackled, for a tackle to occur in law, either one or both knees must be in contact with the ground. In other words, quite often you see players who are actually on their feet, and what we call smother tackle, the term tackle is used, whereas in law, that is not a tackle at all. It's an understanding of the word tackle, but it doesn't apply that way in law, because at least one or more or two knees must be in contact with the ground for a tackle to occur. Now, once the tackle has occurred, the player that's being tackled has certain obligations to meet under law, and these are crucial, as you say, to the continuity of the game that we play in New Zealand and wanting to have the ball available. The player must either release the ball,
This incredible young man, just
or place the ball,
great runs N.Z.R.EU. Excellent play.
or pass the ball. And quite often it's that last option that is the one that's misunderstood. A lot of players don't, for some reason, think they can't pass the ball off the ground. Well, they can, providing they do so immediately. And this is the key word, that each of those three actions, release, place, or pass, must be done immediately. Now, immediately is a pretty long word, but it is spelt Q-I-C-K. And that is really what the referee is looking for from the player who has gone to ground to meet those actions, or else he will have to act quickly or immediately in making a decision. Now, let's propose that the player is able to meet those obligations and the ball is placed. That then means the ball is available and play can continue. Quite often someone will come along, pick up the ball, continue on play. A ruck may be formed, or quite often the ball sometimes does become unplayable. Now, let's have a look at the actions of the tackler, because I think in my experience, it is the actions of this guy, the tackler, who is the destructive element in the game. And it's from him that the majority of penalties invariably occur, because of one simple fact, and that's he has not allowed the tackler, the tackled player, the guy that's got the ball in his possession, to meet his obligations under law, i.e. release, place or pass. And there's a lot of rule of thumb from a refereeing perspective. Quite often if a tackle is made from the hips down, therefore it means that the arms are free. Therefore the tackled player can very easily meet his obligations. But whereas if we have a smother tackle where the ball carrier is enveloped around the arms or around the chest area and the ball is sealed in, then obviously the responsibility to allow that ball carrier to release the ball must be on the tackler, because it is his very actions that are preventing the player being able to release it. And so from a refereeing perspective, we would immediately focus in straight away on the actions of the tackler, and he would be the person who is penalised because he had not allowed the play to continue in that manner. So I think we've got to make those 2 points very, very clear, that there are responsibilities of both the tackler and the person who is being tackled. There are then certain obligations on both those people when they hit the ground, and that is they must roll clear. Now we know in a lot of cases that's quite often very difficult to do because they may be trapped, there may be other players in that vicinity. But they must not interfere with the play at all. They can't play the ball on the ground, they can't even attempt to tackle another player on the ground, because as we know, rugby is a game that's played by players on their feet, and so any actions they do must be on their feet. So they must endeavour to roll away, or if they are trapped, at least remain passive and do nothing out of it. If the ball, for example, in that scenario becomes trapped, and it quite often can because the actions of the bodies, the way they land on the ground, we know the requirement that any third and fourth players must remain on their feet if they wish to play that ball. Sometimes, of course, however, they do get pushed or barged or do actually end up in a heap on top of the players or on the ground. And in that case, the ball becomes unplayable. And in that scenario, the scrum feed, the referee would blow the ball very quickly. We would be asking referees to not delay in that area, don't allow play to continue in the hope that the ball will come out, to blow up very quickly, form a scrummage, and the scrum feed, of course, will go to the team that was in possession prior to that particular stoppage.
Right.
Which that means a turnover doesn't apply in that area of the game, because it's a tackle, it's gone to the ground, play has become unplayable. The referee would award the team to the team that was in possession, which is normally the team, the guy that's been tackled, and his team would receive the scrum feed because they were the team that were going forward at that point. So I think in summary of the tackle, we're looking at very responsible actions by the person who's been tackled, that he releases, places or passes, and that he endeavours to roll clear after that and doesn't take any further action. We're looking at the action of the tackler, that he allows the tackled player to meet those options and allows them to do so. We're looking at the actions of the third and fourth and subsequent players who arrive at a tackle, and that they, wherever possible, endeavour to remain on their feet, and in fact if they wish to play the ball or take any part in the game, they must be on their feet. And I think they are the key areas from the tackle, because it's after that that other aspects of the game will develop.
Dave, you've described the tackler and the tackled player, but the third and fourth man arriving must stay on his feet. But the third or fourth man too can also form the commencement of the ruck, or form the barrier that the ruck is ultimately built on. He's got some restrictions on him too. What are those? In
the action of the third or fourth player stepping over the ball, he's quite entitled to do that and bind on to arriving opponents. He can take one step over the ball and one further step only. Okay. Now that is not regarded as obstruction. Right. It is regarded as legitimate stepping over the ball in the endeavour to either ruck the ball back or to form a ruck or engage the opposition, providing that he steps over the ball, and that's the key. It must be over the ball, not around the sides, over the ball, and one further step in engaging the opposition. If they then continue to take other steps, obviously they're well in front of the ball area and it would be obstruction, and therefore they would be liable for penalty.
It all sounds so simple and logical, doesn't it? It's just a matter of the players keeping the game flowing. Now we'll look at another set of skills drills. This one is about tactical kicking, evasion and loose ball recovery. The drill will ensure your players increase their level of individual skill.
Firstly, let's look at a grid that will develop the grubber kick. Players move around the square, grubber kicking in order to the other players. Extensions are to move around the square at a faster speed. Move around the square in a different direction, kicking with the other foot. Extend the size of the square. This grid is to develop the skills of punting and catching the high ball. The format is the same as the previous activity. Extensions for this activity are to kick accurately so that the catcher does not have to move, kick with either feet, run faster. In this third grid, 3 players are in the square formation trying to successfully grub a kick to each other, whilst the 4th player is trying to intercept the ball. Extensions are to make the area smaller, allow the interceptor to tag the ball carrier for a changeover. Players who drop or mishandle the ball change with the interceptor. The 4th activity is designed to develop evasion skills in a semi-opposed situation. The ball carrier must run anywhere in the square with his partner trying to stay 1 metre behind.
Watch where you're going. Don't watch
Players rotate roles on command. Extensions are to make the square smaller, have the players run faster, involve other skills such as placing and picking up the ball. In this grid, I will develop evasion skills in a fully opposed one-on-one situation. The player with the ball must get to the opposite end of the grid, whilst the defender must stop them with 2-hand touch. Extensions are to let the defender tackle, make the grid bigger or smaller. Key points for evasion are make the defender hesitate, change direction, increase speed. In this last grid, we look at picking up the ball in an opposed situation. Players in 2 teams number off. When the individual player's number is called, they race with the other team member to pick up the ball. Key points are good body position, knees bent, hands ready to scoop the ball.
That looks easy, but remember, increasing the intensity of the drill will make your players respond. Now we're moving into specialised fitness techniques, the fitness needed by players in various positions. Jim Blair, the former All Black fitness advisor, reveals how to prepare your players and the different requirements in strength, endurance and speed needed according to the position played.
If we could start with the props and locks, you've spent 8 weeks working on total body strength. You should now split it up and continue working in the gymnasium, but cut it down to twice a week. In the upper body, you should start looking at the objective being to increase the local muscle endurance of your upper body. A game of rugby lasts in active play approximately 34 minutes. You, as a lock or a prop, will spend approximately 12 minutes of that time physically contesting possession of the ball in scrums, line-outs, mauls and rucks. And it's this type of muscle endurance that, in actual fact, push you towards fatigue quicker than possibly the running will do. So it's essential that you move into a period of time trying to develop increased local muscle endurance. And this must follow the strength work, because strength is a prerequisite for local muscle endurance. So you would then go on to a program in a gymnasium where you would spend 6 weeks developing upper body endurance using 3 sets of between 20 to 30 repetitions obviously using lighter weights. But you would carry on with leg strength, using very heavy weights, and 3 sets of 5 to 7 repetitions. Now the hookers, the halfbacks, and the back row, that is number 7, 6, and 8, you will follow on with the leg strength program and also with the upper body endurance. But with the leg one, slightly different. You will tend to use lighter weights, but use them in an explosive fashion. So when you lift the weight, you will lift it in an explosive way, as fast as you possibly can, and lower it very slowly. What we're moving here is from basic strength to using your strength more quickly. That is, to develop power. When it comes to the running part, again, a slight change. With the locks and the props, we'll be cutting down the duration, but increasing the intensity of your running. So twice a week, you will be cutting your run down to 30 minutes, but the intensity must be very high. So you're looking at covering that 30 minutes at the fastest pace you can hang on to. The third time, we're going into a system which helps you to postpone oxygen debt. Now that may not have much meaning for you, but if you think back to games where you get very tired and no matter how hard you tried, your legs just wouldn't go any faster, this is you going into oxygen debt. To try to postpone that, you would do once a week, 150 metre, not sprints, but running very hard. So you would run hard for 150 metres, and your recovery would be a slow jog back to the start. I would expect you to do between 14 to 16 repetitions of this. So for props and locks, your weekly preparation is now 2 30-minute runs, 12 to 16, 150 metres. In the gymnasium, upper body local muscle endurance, 3 sets of 20 to 30 repetitions. The other training thing would be starting speed work. Now, one of the things about speed work, you've done a lot of running, but it's all been heel-toe. You're now starting to move into sprinting, which is an entirely different action. So what we do is we cut down acceleration initially. So I'd expect you to look at sprints of 50 metres, but taking the first 20 metres to get to top pace. Now that way, we cut down the potential strain and injury of the calf muscle. So that's what you do for the next 6 weeks. With the hookers, the back row and the halfback, you would also cut your runs down to 30 minutes. Again, the fastest pace you can hang on to, doing this once a week. The other 2 training sessions a week would again be on to the 150 metre hard runs. Twice a week for you, repetitions 16, recovery, a slow jog back to the start, and your pace is approximately 90% of your sprint pace. In the gymnasium, doing explosive work on the legs using light weights and about 10 to 12 repetitions, 3 sets of these. Concentrate on lifting the weights explosively. With the backs, we must now start getting you in to emphasizing speed. In a game, you would be, if we accumulated all the distances you sprinted in a game, you're looking at something between 1.5 to 2 kilometres of actual sprinting distances you would achieve in the game. That emphasis must be placed in your training program. So we would cut your running down to twice a week, similar to the forwards, 30 minutes, as fast as you possibly can over that 30 minutes. Carry on with your strength work once a week, just to maintain this, and again working on very heavy weights, 5 to 7 repetitions, 3 sets. With the speed work, we would divide it into acceleration as well as speed endurance. So you would look at using a form of plyometric work. Each of your speed days, that you have 3 of these, use a box approximately 70 centimetres high, and you step off this box and land on a soft surface. Immediately you land, you explode into a 10-metre sprint. Now, maximum effort must be made in this, and the first movement must be made as soon as possible after both feet touch the ground. This is to aid in your acceleration. To make it a bit more relative to the game, as well as going off and sprinting straight forward, sometimes come off backwards, hit and turn. Sometimes use a ball and include a sidestep or a swerve in that initial 10 metres. The whole purpose of this exercise is to develop your acceleration. I would do 10 repetitions of these prior to your speed work 3 times a week. With your speed work, there's a whole variety of things you can do. But again, I would start off with 50-metre sprints, with the first 20 metres gradually accelerating. And it's only the last 30 metres that you will be putting 100% effort into this. Another very useful sprint is what's called ins and outs. It uses a principle called the Valsalva effect, where you are actually stronger if you hold your breath. So you lay out a distance of 60 metres. Divide that 60 metres into a 20-metre band, a 10-metre band, a 20-metre band, and a 10-metre band. Gradually accelerate through the first 20 metres. At the end of that, you should be hitting full pace. You take a deep breath, and you hold that breath and sprint flat out for 10 metres. At the end of that 10 metres, start breathing again and slowing down. Halfway through the next 20-metre band, start picking up the pace again. At full pace at the end of it, hold your breath, sprint flat out for 10 metres. So the 20 metres is the time to accelerate and breathe. The 10 metres is the time to sprint flat out and hold your breath. That way we encourage the muscles in the legs, the muscles that you're using to sprint in a stronger fashion and therefore enhancing your speed. You could also watch your technique. You can do this by running 50-metre sprints at just under full pace. Get someone to look at you. What's your technique like? Are you getting a good knee lift? Are your arms moving correctly? What's your body position like? Do this, some with the ball, some without the ball, and get somebody watching you from maybe 10, 15, 20 metres away to give you some advice on your technique. Sled sprinting is another technique you can use. If you don't have a sled, use a tyre. Try to have the tyre weighing about 30 kilograms and tie it to your waist so it's about 10 feet behind you. Sprint flat out for 30 metres, towing the tyre behind you. Downhill sprints, very good for increasing leg speed, but it has its dangers. Make sure it is a very shallow incline, only about 1%, and you sprint downhill for 20 metres. Speed shoot sprints are another. If you have that type of equipment available, this provides a very, very relevant form of increasing your speed. The small parachutes that are attached to your waist by a Velcro belt, and you sprint for 40 metres. At the 20-metre mark, you can just rip the parachute off and carry on sprinting for another 20 metres. The first half of the sprint emphasises increasing power in your legs. What we're looking is for the legs moving faster than they have before. With these sprint techniques, use a variety of them. The variety will keep your interest. Where possible, use a ball. Where possible, when you're going 100% throughout the full distance, try to simulate what's happening in the game by using side steps and swerves in the first 15-20 metres. I would do in the region of 20 to 25 repetitions. In the 60-metre ones, the ins and outs, because of the distance, probably bring it down to 15. So in your free speed days, you have the acceleration work off the box, 10 repetitions, followed by your 15 to 25 to 30 actual sprints. With sprinting, you will get the best effect if you are fully recovered after each sprint. So just easily walk back to the start, make sure you're fully recovered before you start the next thing. As you approach the season and games start, you've got to remember that more is not better. There is often a delay in how the body reacts to training. So when the season games start, you do nothing the day before a game and nothing the day afterwards. The rest the day before will allow you to fully recover and let the body be fully regenerated so that you actually get the benefit of your fitness work where it counts, on the field. John Money was recently quoted as saying there's no point in being a Tarzan in the gymnasium and a Jane on the field. This can happen to you if you do far too much. Overtraining is subtle, but very damaging. One very valid method of identifying overtraining is to take your pulse for 3 or 4 days, immediately you wake up for 15 seconds and establish your normal wake-up 15-second pulse. While you're training pre-season, check your pulse regularly. If it is up to 4 beats higher than 15 seconds than normal, no matter what is on your program, cut it by 50%. If it is more than 4 beats and 15 seconds higher than normal, you do nothing until the pulse returns to normal. The increase in the pulse over your normal indicates that your body hasn't fully recovered. If you continue with your normal program in that state, you will get very little, if any, benefit from your fitness. In fact, what can happen is you will lose fitness. So please remember, more quality is much better than doing more. Otherwise, you will leave all your best performances on the training track rather than where it counts and where it will help you secure your place throughout the season on the park. Good luck.
As you can see, specialising in fitness for each position is going to pay big dividends for your team. It will help transform your side into winners and make the game more enjoyable. This specialised preparation is essential for another vital reason: injury prevention and treatment. Former All Black doctor John MAYHEW now explains why thoughtful preparation before the game and swift action when injuries do occur will, in most cases, quickly get your players back into the action.
Rugby is a contact game and injuries are inevitable. The most common injuries are the bruises, the strains, the cuts, the minor injuries. The most common joint involved is the knee, followed closely by ankle and hand injuries, plus shoulder injuries. Most of these are not severe, but 1 to 2% of all rugby injuries do necessitate medical help and specialist assessment.
From a coach's perspective, what do I need to know about rugby injuries?
I think the majority of rugby injuries can be treated by non-medical people, and there's some very basic principles that need to be adhered to. As discussed in earlier programs, each team should have a medical kit, and one of the most fundamental parts of that should be a bucket of ice or a chili bin full of ice, and with necessary ice bags to wrap the ice around the injured limb. I think there's very little harm in any injury, whether it's a broken leg or just a sprained muscle, of putting an ice pack on it, and there's certainly a lot of advantages to do that. So I think we need to stick to the RICE principle. That's rest, i.e. if you injure yourself, you come off the field, rule number 1. Then you ice the affected part, whether it's a hamstring, a calf muscle. Do that for 10 to 15 minutes every couple of hours. Between times you should have a good compression bandage on it, and also the limb should be elevated. So it's very simple. It's RICE, rest, ice, compression, elevation. With that, if the injury seems more severe, that can be handled by the coach or by the parent or whatever, then seek medical advice. But do the basic stuff first. If the injury seems worse than that, then seek professional help. But most injuries can be dealt with very at a low level, low expense, and very well.
What about the hamstring injuries?
Hamstring injuries are a common rugby injury. The hamstrings are the muscles at the back of the thigh, and they occur normally when there's an explosive event that someone takes off from a standing start. Perhaps they have an inadequate warm-up, they might have slipped on the ground, and it's a muscle tear. So basically the initial treatment is the same as I mentioned before. The rest, ice, compression, elevation, And then most of those would benefit from a course of either anti-inflammatory medication plus advice and treatment from your local physiotherapist. A lot of hamstring injuries are due to sort of inadequate sort of training techniques or poor warm-up. So those are things that can be attended to in the rehabilitation phase.
How long should I stop playing rugby for if I have a hamstring injury?
There's the varying grades of severity of hamstring injuries from just a minor strain to a complete tear, and I think really that will determine when you get back to playing sport, as it would with any other muscle tear. If you've done a complete tear of a hamstring, you're mostly looking at 6 to 8 weeks. With a minor strain, it might be 1 to 2 games, and there's a continuum between that. So obviously anything over a minor strain, I think, should be seen by a health professional, your local GP, physiotherapist, or sports trainer, and get advice from there.
Tell us why they have a blood bin and what happens.
The blood bin was introduced several years ago in rugby, following the example of rugby league, where players who have bleeding are forced to come from the field. I think this is a very good rule, and you can put a temporary replacement on while that player is attended to. There's a number of risks, a number of reasons the blood bin came in. One, it was to protect the injured player, so that his wound was dealt with and it didn't get infected and it could be assessed in a non-hurried fashion. The other reason it was brought in was to protect the other 29 players on the field. If a player is hosing blood out, they're potentially at risk of infecting players on the field. The most likely risk in New Zealand would be hepatitis B, and as an aside, I would encourage any player in a contact sport to have hepatitis B vaccination. It's a cheap, inexpensive vaccination, and I think it should be done. So you can protect that. There's a potential, and I think a very much overstated risk of the transmission of the HIV virus. But certainly the medical attendants or the coaches dealing with a bloody wound on a player, they should be wearing gloves. They should stop the blood flow, put an appropriate bandage on before that player returns to the field. There's even a rugby union ruling that if there's blood on the player's jersey or shorts, they should be replaced. So there's 2 reasons the blood bin was brought in. One, for assessment of the injury, so the player could be assessed while you put a temporary replacement on, and the other was to prevent the risk of infection from the injured player to other participants in the game.
John, what about concussion?
Concussion is the most difficult injury I find in my professional job to assess. It's concussions caused by a blow to the head, which results in a transient sort of alteration in your mental state. It may be associated with loss of consciousness, but it doesn't necessarily have to. The player often has a retrograde amnesia or loss of memory, is a bit dazed and a bit uncertain of what's happened. I believe that any player who receives a blow to the head with any loss of consciousness, any alteration in their sort of level of mental functioning, or has no recollection of the event that occurred leading up to the blow to the head, needs to be assessed by a medical practitioner and to stop playing the game. The reason that concussion is thought of as a very serious injury, and the rugby union have made a mandatory 3-week ban for any player who's concussed, is the potential problems with concussion. You've most probably seen the punch-drunk boxer with repeated concussions. We're now aware that even with one simple concussion, the player can be affected for 3 to 4 weeks afterwards when you do simple tests of mental function, mental arithmetic and things like that. So concussion, there's nothing to see. The player often feels quite well, other than perhaps a few headaches and things like that, and it's only afterwards when they recover fully from the concussion they realise, well, perhaps they weren't as sharp as they thought. So there's that aspect of it. The other thing is if the player who is concussed goes back to play rugby too soon, they're at risk of the second injury. And by that we mean that they're more likely to get injured, and if they do get a second blow to the head within that 3 or 4 week period, it's likely to do a lot more damage than the sum total of the 2 blows individually. So I think it's a very good ruling that the rugby union have made it mandatory that any player who's concussed should be assessed by a medical practitioner and should have a 3-week stand down. Some people may argue that it may be too long for some players and too short for others, but I think in a game where we have to make rules for mass consumption, and we're not all sort of neurologists or medical experts, I think this is a good compromise between being medically safe and not being too long for the player. I believe that any player who is concussed should be assessed by a doctor anyway, and I think it's a good idea to be assessed prior to going back to playing their sport. I'm also asked often about, what can parents or coaches do to prevent concussion? If a player has been concussed, is there anything that can be done to prevent concussion? The simple answer is no. What can help, though, is wearing a properly fitted mouth guard. It's been shown that mouth guards, as well as protecting teeth, reduce the incidence of blows to the face and may reduce the incidence of impact of a blow to the brain. A lot of players now are wearing headgear, and it's almost the norm now to see a backline with two players wearing headgear. Unfortunately, it looks good in terms of injury prevention. It may prevent cuts to the head and neck, but it does no good in preventing the risk of concussion. And I'd like to emphasise that headgear does not make it safe for a player who's had several concussions to go back onto the rugby field. It'll make no difference to the risk of concussion.
Now, what about neck injuries?
Neck injuries do occur in rugby. Fortunately, in the last 5 or 6 years, the incidence of neck injuries in rugby has decreased. There are a number of reasons for that. I think there's better training methods now, a greater awareness of the problem with neck injuries, and I think the change in the scrummaging rules, especially at the lower grades. We see from a medical perspective that the most common age group for neck injuries is the sort of 17 to early 20s. Things which can predispose to that are players playing out of position. If you're built like Ian Jones, you don't play in the front row. That's a simple rule. And so if you're the wrong body type, despite your team being short of a prop, you're better not to play the game than to put a string bean, with due respect to Ian Jones, in the front row. So there's a mismatch of strength. Some players, their body types are just not up to it, and I think we have to be aware of that. Unfortunately, the Rugby Union changed the rules on scrummaging a few years ago, thinking they would lessen the impact of neck injuries in rugby. Fully 50% of all neck injuries occur outside the scrum, so I think we have to be aware of that. Even if we abolish the scrum in rugby, we'd still have neck injuries. How do we prevent that? We've got to give more emphasis to conditioning of the neck muscles, and the average rugby player doesn't spend any time conditioning his neck muscles, especially the forwards or the midfield backs. I think this has to be part of your pre-season and season training program, a neck conditioning exercise program. You can discuss this with your medical advisor, physiotherapist or team trainer, and I think it should be part of it.
As the coach, you hold the responsibility for deciding the best position for your players, especially in regard to physical suitability. And now to look at what your team and players want to achieve this year. Here, Lee Smith, the New Zealand Director of Coaching, shows us how to create a game plan and reveals how zones and lanes aren't just terms you encounter on the streets or motorways.
Once the team profile has been developed, the coach and the team are now in a position to put together their aims for the season. The season can be divided into a number of sections. Often, if aims are set for the entire season, the end of the season is so far away that players have trouble relating to it. Therefore, by dividing the season into a number of sections, identifiable aims can be set and developed as the season progresses. Of course, the aims have to be measurable, because at the end of each section of the season, the coach must be able to look back on what has been achieved in conjunction with team members to assess their level of success. Now that we have established the aim of the season, we must put down on paper what has to be achieved by the team in order to meet that aim. This is the game plan. It is based on the team profile and the principles of play, both attack and defence, so that it has consistency with the way that the team profile has been developed. It is very unlikely that a team will have a game plan for the entire length of the field, especially in attack and to a lesser degree in defence. So that the players can focus on what is required, the simplest method of developing a game plan is to divide the field into a number of zones: the defensive quarter, the middle half, and the attacking quarter are obvious ways of dividing the field so that the game plan can come through and be a focus of player attention. However, coaches may have other ways of dividing the field laterally. As decision-making amongst the players becomes more sophisticated and the ability of players increases, a further two methods of developing the game plan can be used. The first is to divide the field into lanes down the field. with certain patterns being played in each lane. The first lane may be between the touchline and the 15-metre line. For reasons of tactics, in this area, the team may maul the second phase play, while between the 15-metre lines, rucking may be the most obvious and best method of developing second phase play. Finally, the most sophisticated way of developing a game plan is to base it on the player's powers of observation. Most importantly, focusing on the positioning of the opposition. The opposition may be manipulated into a given part of the field, and based on their positioning, the team will execute an attacking or defensive move. This is difficult for young players because their experience of the game is not great. However, the higher the level of play, the more the coach should tend to empower the players to make a decision in their own right and to base the game plan on the manipulated positioning of the opposition. Once the game plan has been established, the team knows what it is trying to achieve when it plays. The next step is to look at how the team is to achieve the game plan. This is based on the patterns of play. It is these patterns of the play that are the subject of the next program.
Implanting your team's game plan over the opposition's, that's what it's all about. The last segment of this tape is from expert physiotherapist Dave Abercrombie. Ankle injuries can ruin or frustrate your player's season. Dave's easy-to-follow demonstration of strapping an ankle will prove how effective strapping can be and how your team management can comfortably do the job required.
Ankle injuries are very common in rugby. How do you decide if an ankle needs to be strapped, or what are the benefits of strapping an ankle?
Well, initially we strap for means of protection, so that may be a rigid strapping or a soft strapping, but we do it in order to protect the damaged ligament. During the rehabilitation phase, we use the strapping to support the ankle, or support the joint, and try and prevent further injury to it. And then later on within the rehabilitation phase, we use the sensory input of the tape in order to protect the joint. So if you've got an individual who's running, hopefully if they roll the ankle a wee bit, it produces stretch on the tape. That in turn affects the skin, and so that you get a feedback to the musculature above and below the ankle, and that in turn will stabilise the ankle. When we get the person back playing again, we graduate the amount of tape that we use, the degree of rigid taping and soft strapping that we use, and it's there as a means initially to protect the joint totally, and then as time goes on we might use a soft strap of some sort, a lace-up or a rigid strapping with only a little bit of tape in order to add some skin sensitivity or proprioception. So there are a number of reasons, but ultimately we graduate it with a view to getting the individual back playing again without any sort of strapping at all. Now that may take up to a year. You know, they may play a full season with a degree of tape or bracing of some sort on the ankle.
Right. So I understand from that, I mean, a common question I get asked by players is that they sprain their ankle and they want to know how long they need to have their ankle strapped for. Is it for the rest of the year, the rest of their career? Is it worth strapping the other ankle which hasn't been injured to prevent it doing the same injury there?
Well, again, it depends on the severity of the injury. If you've had a reasonably severe strain of a ligament, either the lateral ligament of the ankle or the knee ligaments themselves, you tend to be strapping a lot longer through the season, and as I said previously, you may end up by taping for a whole season just to give the player some confidence, and that's often all it is. If you talk about league or professional football, they are actually required to tape their ankles, both ankles, before training and also before every game, and if they fail to do so and they injure their ankles, they can be heavily fined. So there is a preventative reason for taping. Again, some of the braces that are available can also help, as I mentioned previously as well. A soft strap and a brace on top of it can be enough to protect the joint itself. The way in which you tape is very important, but the taping is only as good as its adhesion to the skin, so you want a clean, dry limb to tape on, and so shaving is very important. We also use what we call a leuco spray, which is a tack spray, and that's to help protect the skin itself. It also prevents the risk of infection, or takes away some of the risk of infection, helps the tape adhere to the limb, and we then can lay on top of that. So maybe we'll just demonstrate it and go from there. So first of all, we'll just put a light spray on the top of the ankle itself. We're going to assume at this stage that Slade has damaged the fibres of his lateral ligament, namely the middle and the anterior fibres, and so what we want to do is place the joint in a neutral position and just ask Slade to hold it in that position there. Now, if we feel that the joint is particularly unstable, then what we will do is we'll move the joint into a little bit of what we call eversion. But I think for safety's sake, and that's what we're really after here, is to have a joint that's just in the neutral position. Now, there are a number of taping methods, so what I'm going to demonstrate now is fairly basic, but very effective in terms of stabilising the outer ligaments of the ankle joint. So first of all, what we want is a locking tape. Again, we split the tape, because if we roll the tape right round the ankle, you run a risk of getting a circulation problem as the limb builds up with blood during exercise. We don't want to run into a situation where we cut off the circulation by having that top tape too tight. Now we go from here and we take some stirrups. So usually about 3, and we start just behind the little bony bump on the inside of the ankle, and it's called your medial malleolus, and we always tape from the inside out for a lateral ligament strain. Now the secret of taping is to actually lay the tape on without pulling it hard. If you pull the tape hard, you risk circulatory problems, and also you risk cramping in the joint if the tape's put on too hard. Now this is a rigid strapping, so if you lay it on effectively, it will not give in a longitudinal way. It'll tear quite easily acrossways, unlike a non-rigid strap, which tends to be softer, more difficult to tear, but will stretch in maybe 2 or 4 directions. So we now overlay half of the initial stirrup and lead the tape back up around the joint. And again, do not pull hard as you pull the tape up over the outside. The other thing that you have to be aware of is that because rigid strapping doesn't flow onto the skin in the same way that a softer strapping will be, everyone's joints are a wee bit different, and so you have to be careful to let the tape just flow. You don't want to end up with creases in the tape, especially around the area of the foot itself. And finally, with an ankle, one of the areas that you have to be very aware of is this little spot where my finger is. It's called the base of the 5th metatarsal, and it's basically an area that if you put pressure on it, it's the bottom of the little toe, then these people suffer severe cramping problems when they're actually inside the boot and running around. So you want to make sure that this area is not taped over with a rigid strapping. We'll now go for a 3rd stirrup. Obviously the larger the foot, the more number of stirrups you might need, but again we just flow on. Now as I come over with this stirrup, the tape just wants to flow a little bit across the joint, and I'm quite happy with letting it do so, because the movement we're trying to prevent is the ankle from coming in this direction, or in an inversion. And I think we'll go, there's the base of the 5th again, I think we'll go for another stirrup, and again we're now overlaying half of the joint, we're over the top of the malleolus, and we'll just take that last stirrup up, and that's covering now the anterior fibres, or the front fibres of that lateral ligament. At this stage it's worth just taking the ankle joint and just giving it a little pull to see whether the tape has been effective in stabilising the inversion movement, which is what you're trying to achieve. If you don't feel that the tape is quite rigid enough, it's quite all right to just lay on another lateral strip or an outside strip, whereby you just pull a last stirrup up over the outside of the joint. Now, what we want to do at this stage is just lock all of that in. That's a good rigid strapping. It's simple to lay on, but it will move unless you're locked in on the top. And what we then do is take a number of strips and just fill in the top half of the ankle. Again, being careful not to crease the tape if at all possible. And then the bottom half. Now, an area that I tend to avoid as much as possible is putting tape around the lower area of the tendo Achilles down in here, because any rubbing over that can create an irritation of the tendon itself, and again over the front tendon of the top of the joint. We can use a softer strapping over those areas, but not a rigid strapping that can lead to any sort of irritation. And finally, we just use a slight modification of a basket weave to stabilise the lower areas of tape that so far haven't been covered. Now, what we have now is a perfectly firm and stable ankle strap that will give Slade both protection of the joint as well as some proprioceptive input should he roll on it a wee bit. Now, to finish off the ankle, we may use a semi-rigid strapping, such as an elastoplast, which it's what we call a 1002. It is used to support the joint and provide a little extra stability. Now, it's often a personal thing. Some individuals don't like having an overwrap on top, and others do. So if we're going to use them, we use what we call a figure-8 strap, starting on the outside of the ankle. Again, thinking about where the base of the fifth metatarsal is, we don't want to roll over the top of that, and thinking about the alignment of the ligaments themselves. So we start over the front of the joint, we roll around the back, come across the outside of the ankle, pull up underneath the arch, and with a semi-rigid strap you can afford to give it a little bit of stretch, whereas the rigid taping you lay it on, this you can afford to just give it a little bit of a pull. We then come around the inside of the heel again, and finally we can pull up, giving it a little extra squeeze in order to reinforce the outside ligament of the ankle in this case. And we then just fill the roll in, and there we have it. Just extra support and hopefully quite a stable ankle and rigid ankle support. Feel okay?
Sweet.
And then all we do there is a pair of scissors and roll the edge off. Now occasionally it's important just to take a rigid tape, pop it on over the top, and that will just stop the corners of the last piece of tape there curling back and perhaps catching.
Abbo, this is the sort of taping that's done prior to a player replaying and going back to play. With the sort of taping you do when a player comes off with an injured ankle is quite different from this.
That's right, yes. This is a tape that we use during the early stages of rehabilitation and often during playing. When someone comes off the field, we'd use a soft crepe bandage or something similar and fill the ankle in, and by filling it in I mean tape basically from the toes to about the mid-calf and often to above the knee, because what we're trying to do in that situation is not so much prevent injury through someone rolling the ankle, but actually protect the joint, and in so doing we want to make sure that we cover all of the foot and ankle up into the calf so that we don't have areas that swelling can push out of. In the early stages we don't use a rigid type strapping. This is purely for a rehabilitation and a playing phase.